Charleston, South Carolina, was a city steeped in tradition, its cobblestone streets and pastel-colored row houses whispering tales of an unyielding past. It was a place where reputation mattered more than character and where deviation from the norm was met with raised eyebrows and hushed whispers. Margaret Hargrove had navigated this environment with precision her entire life. At 37 she was the epitome of propriety, a dedicated professor of English literature, the daughter of a well-respected pastor, and an unwavering pillar of the local community. Her life was carefully curated, a tapestry woven from discipline and routine. Each morning began with a neatly pressed skirt and blouse, a cup of Earl Grey, and the gentle hum of classical music in her quiet home. Margaret rarely strayed from this rhythm. Friends were acquaintances she saw at church or academic events. Evenings were spent grading papers or immersed in the works of Austen and Hawthorne. Her existence was ordered, predictable and, though she would never admit it, achingly lonely. The first day of the fall semester began like any other. Margaret stood before the lectern in her classroom, her voice calm and measured as she reviewed the syllabus with the new batch of students. Her lecture hall, an austere room with high windows and faded wooden desks, felt like a sanctuary. Literature had always been her refuge, a world where she could lose herself in the emotions of others without ever risking her own. But today the air seemed different, heavier, as though something unseen was pressing against the carefully constructed walls of her world. Then Claire Bellamy walked in. Margaret's words faltered for a fraction of a second, a lapse so brief that no one but her would have noticed. Claire was late, her boots echoing boldly against the polished floor as she strode to the only available seat near the front. Her crimson hair was tied into a loose knot that revealed the edge of a tattoo curling around the nape of her neck, and her leather jacket hung carelessly from one shoulder. She carried herself with an air of defiance, as if daring the room to question her audacity. Margaret's pulse quickened, though she couldn't say why. She cleared her throat and continued her lecture, avoiding looking directly at Claire. But it was impossible not to feel her presence. The young woman's energy was electric, commanding attention without effort. Margaret found herself hyper-aware of the sound of Claire flipping through her notebook, the occasional tilt of her head as she listened, the way her fingers absent-mindedly twirled a pen. It wasn't until halfway through the class that Claire spoke for the first time. Margaret had posed a question about the recurring theme of isolation in Emily Dickinson's poetry, expecting the usual hesitance from the students. Claire's voice cut through the silence, low and confident. Dickinson wasn't just writing about loneliness. She was rebelling against the constraints of her time. Her isolation wasn't a weakness. It was her power. Margaret turned to Claire, startled by the intensity in her tone. An interesting interpretation, she replied, her voice steady but her heart beat anything but. Would you care to elaborate? Claire's lips curled into a faint smile, and she leaned back in her chair as if savoring the attention. I'm nobody. Who are you? It's not self-pity. It's a declaration. She's rejecting the idea of conforming to society's expectations. She's saying she'd rather be a nobody than lose herself trying to be a somebody. Margaret felt a twinge in her chest, a pang of something she couldn't quite name. The room seemed to fade, the other students disappearing into the background as Claire's words hung in the air. There was something raw and unapologetic about her that made Margaret feel exposed, as though Claire could see through the layers of her carefully constructed facade. As the class ended, Margaret returned to her office, her mind a storm of contradictions. She chastised herself for the quickening of her pulse, for the way her gaze had lingered on Claire longer than was appropriate. It wasn't as if this was the first time she had encountered an outspoken student. But there was something about Claire, something unsettling and magnetic, that refused to be ignored. Claire, for her part, had noticed Margaret the moment she walked into the room. There was an elegance to her, a quiet authority that demanded respect. But beneath the polished exterior, Claire detected a vulnerability, a subtle hesitance in her movements that suggested there was more to the professor than met the eye. She's fascinating, Claire murmured to herself as she walked across campus after class. It wasn't just Margaret's poise or the way her voice carried an undercurrent of warmth despite her reserved demeanor. It was the fleeting moments when her composure cracked, a slight flush in her cheeks, a pause that lingered a beat too long. Claire lived for challenges, and Margaret Hargrove was the most intriguing one she had encountered in years. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room, a glass of wine untouched on the side table as she graded papers. She should have been focusing on the essays in front of her, but her mind kept drifting to Claire's voice, the passion with which she had spoken about Dickinson. Margaret's chest tightened as she recalled the way Claire's eyes had seemed to lock onto hers during the discussion, bold and unflinching. "This is absurd," Margaret muttered under her breath, closing the folder of essays with a sharp snap. She pushed herself off the couch and began pacing the room, as if movement could banish the restless energy coursing through her. But no matter how much she tried to suppress it, the truth lingered, unspoken and undeniable. For the first time in years, Margaret felt alive. And it terrified her. The weeks following the start of the semester were a test of Margaret's carefully cultivated restraint. She avoided Claire Bellamy as much as possible, maintaining an air of professionalism that bordered on icy. Yet no matter how diligently she tried, Claire remained an unavoidable presence. A flicker of crimson hair in the classroom, a flash of that mischievous smile during discussions, and always, those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Margaret told herself she was imagining things. Claire was just another student, albeit a particularly charismatic and sharp-tongued one. But her rationalizations crumbled under the weight of her own reactions. Why did her chest tighten whenever Claire spoke? Why did her pulse quicken when their gazes met? These were questions Margaret refused to answer. Then came the evening that unraveled it all. The university hosted a monthly literary event, where students and faculty gathered to celebrate poetry and prose. Margaret usually found solace at these gatherings, appreciating the focus on words and the creative expressions of her students. That night, the room buzzed with conversation as students took turns reading pieces of their own or works by their favorite authors. Margaret stood near the back of the small auditorium, sipping lukewarm coffee and nodding politely as one of her colleagues discussed Shakespeare. When Claire's name was called, Margaret froze. She hadn't known Claire would be participating. The young woman ascended the stage with an air of unshakable confidence, holding a single sheet of paper in her hands. The room quieted almost immediately, the audience sensing something different about her presence. Claire adjusted the microphone, her fingers trailing along its stem, and began. Her voice was low and measured, each word imbued with a quiet intensity. The poem was hers, raw and unfiltered, brimming with sensuality and vulnerability. The imagery was both delicate and arresting, fingers brushing skin like whispers, unspoken desires coiling like smoke in the air, the weight of longing that demanded to be felt but not named. Margaret's breath caught as the words washed over her, striking chords she hadn't known existed. But it wasn't just the poem. It was the way Claire's eyes sought hers midway through, locking onto her as though no one else in the room existed. The connection was electric, intimate, and utterly overwhelming. Margaret felt a flush rising up her neck, her grip tightening around the coffee cup she held. She wanted to look away, to sever the invisible thread pulling her in, but she couldn't. She was ensnared. When the poem ended, the room erupted in applause. Claire gave a slight bow, her expression one of quiet satisfaction, and descended the stage. Margaret, meanwhile, stood rooted to the spot, her heart racing. The moment had felt too personal, too intentional, and she didn't know what to do with the emotions roiling inside her. She didn't have to wonder for long. "Professor Hargrove," Claire's voice came from behind her, smooth and unhurried. Margaret turned to find her standing close, too close. Claire was still holding the paper with her poem, its edges slightly crumpled. Her smile was soft but held an edge of playfulness. "Your performance was evocative," Margaret said, struggling to maintain her composure. "Thank you." Claire tilted her head, studying Margaret like a puzzle she was determined to solve. "I saw you watching. Did you like it?" Margaret's stomach flipped. "It was well written. You have a gift for expressing complex emotions. Coming from you, that means a lot," Claire replied, her tone dipping into something almost intimate. Then, with a boldness that sent Margaret's nerves alight, she added, "You're always so composed. It's nice to know I can leave an impression." The comment was like a spark in a dry forest. Margaret stiffened, her voice sharp as she replied, "I leave personal matters out of the classroom, Miss Bellamy." Claire didn't flinch. If anything, her smile widened, a cat playing with its prey. "I wasn't aware we were in class right now." The audacity of the remark left Margaret momentarily speechless. She cleared her throat, searching for an escape. "Excuse me," she muttered, brushing past Claire and heading for the exit. But she could still feel the weight of Claire's gaze on her back, and it lingered long after she left the room. The next morning, Margaret arrived at her office earlier than usual, eager to bury herself in work and forget the events of the previous evening. She turned on her desk lamp and set her briefcase down, already pulling out papers to grade. But as she reached for a stack of essays, her hand stopped. There, sitting neatly in the center of her desk, was a book she recognized immediately, a well-loved copy of 100 Poems of Rumi. Its edges were worn and inside yellowed sticky notes peeked out from several pages. Margaret frowned, picking it up cautiously. She opened the book to find a folded note tucked between 2 pages. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, looping letters that could only belong to Claire. The message was simple, yet it sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. Sometimes poems say what words cannot. Margaret's fingers tightened around the book, her heart pounding. The gesture was bold, intimate, and undeniably personal. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, stirring emotions she had spent years suppressing. This wasn't a simple act of admiration. It was a challenge, a quiet declaration that Claire had seen the cracks in her armor and wasn't afraid to push further. For the rest of the day, Margaret couldn't focus. The book sat on her desk like a phantom, its presence both haunting and exhilarating. She wanted to confront Claire, to demand an explanation, but deep down she knew that wasn't the real reason she hesitated. She wasn't just afraid of Claire's boldness. She was afraid of her own reaction to it. The weeks that followed Claire's audacious gesture with the book were a whirlwind of emotions for Margaret. Each encounter in the classroom felt charged, as if the very air around them had thickened with unspoken tension. Claire's eyes followed her movements with a focus that made Margaret feel both exhilarated and exposed. It was as if Claire had peeled back the layers Margaret had spent years constructing and seen the vulnerable, restless soul beneath. Margaret's inner turmoil grew more pronounced with every passing day. She oscillated between moments of rigid denial, where she convinced herself that Claire's attention was nothing more than harmless infatuation, and moments where her own feelings betrayed her. At night, as she lay in bed, the memory of Claire's voice reading poetry would echo in her mind, and she hated the way it stirred something in her chest that she couldn't name. She became hyper-aware of the boundaries she was meant to uphold. The university had strict policies regarding relationships between faculty and students, and Margaret's own moral compass screamed at her to maintain propriety. But the rules felt flimsy against the tide of emotions she couldn't control. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on the tension between them. She didn't push too hard, but her interest was unmistakable. She continued to participate in class discussions with the same sharp wit and passion, but there was an undercurrent to her words, a subtle provocation that only Margaret seemed to notice. And when their eyes met, Claire's gaze lingered just a second too long, leaving Margaret breathless and flustered. It was a particularly cold autumn afternoon when the dam finally broke. Margaret had spent the day in a haze, struggling to focus on her work. By the time her office hours ended, the thought of returning to her empty house filled her with a sense of dread. She decided, on impulse, to stop at a small cafe she often visited for its quiet atmosphere and good tea. As she stepped inside, the warmth of the space enveloped her, and she allowed herself a moment of reprieve. But her peace was short-lived. Sitting at a corner table, her crimson hair catching the light, was Claire. She was hunched over a notebook, her fingers stained with ink and the faintest smile playing on her lips. Margaret froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She considered leaving, but Claire looked up at that exact moment, her face lighting up as their eyes met. "Professor Hargrove," Claire called, her voice warm and inviting. "Fancy seeing you here." Margaret hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to retreat. But something, perhaps exhaustion or curiosity, or the sheer inevitability of it all, propelled her forward. She approached Claire's table, clutching her bag tightly. "This is unexpected," Margaret said, her tone clipped but not unkind. Claire gestured to the seat opposite her. "Join me." It was reckless. Foolish. But before Margaret could think better of it, she found herself sitting down. The conversation began cautiously, with Margaret keeping her responses measured and neutral. They discussed literature, safe territory. Claire spoke animatedly about her favorite authors, her eyes sparkling as she described the books that had shaped her. Margaret couldn't help but admire the passion that radiated from her, the way she seemed to live and breathe the words she read. But soon the conversation took a more personal turn. "What about you?" Claire asked, her voice softening. "Do you ever feel stuck?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Stuck? Yeah." Claire leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "Like you're living someone else's life instead of your own?" The question pierced through Margaret's defenses. She looked down at her hands, tracing the rim of her teacup. "I don't know what you mean." Claire tilted her head, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "I think you do." Margaret felt the weight of Claire's gaze, the way it seemed to see straight through her. Against her better judgment, she found herself answering honestly. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like everything I do is for someone else. To meet expectations, to maintain appearances. There's no room for anything else." Claire's expression softened. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," Margaret said, surprising even herself with the candor in her voice. "But it's what's expected of me. I wouldn't know how to be any other way." Claire was silent for a moment, her eyes searching Margaret's face. "You don't have to be perfect, you know," she said gently. "You're allowed to be human." The words hit Margaret like a thunderclap. She looked up, meeting Claire's gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed too narrow to just the two of them. It was a dangerous place to linger, but Margaret couldn't pull herself away. "What about you?" Margaret asked, desperate to shift the focus. "You seem so confident. Don't you ever feel judged?" Claire let out a soft laugh. "All the time. People look at me and see the tattoos, the hair, the attitude, and they think they've got me figured out. But the truth is, I'm just as scared as anyone else." Margaret frowned. "Scared of what?" "Of not being enough," Claire said simply. "Of being too much for some people and not enough for others. Of putting myself out there and getting hurt." She paused, her eyes locking onto Margaret's. "But I've learned that some things are worth the risk." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret felt her chest tighten, her pulse quickening as Claire's fingers brushed the edge of her hand, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. It was so subtle, so natural, yet it felt seismic. Margaret pulled her hand back abruptly, the spell broken. "I should go," she said, her voice trembling. Claire nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course." Margaret stood, her heart pounding as she gathered her things. As she left the cafe, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. But for the first time in years, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The cafe hummed with quiet activity, the low murmur of voices blending with the soft clinking of cups and saucers. Margaret sat across from Claire, her hands wrapped tightly around a teacup that had long since gone cold. Her posture was rigid, her every movement measured, as if any misstep could shatter the fragile sense of control she clung to. Across from her, Claire sat at ease, her body language relaxed but her eyes sharp, focused entirely on Margaret. Their conversation had drifted from books to bolder subjects, each topic peeling back another layer of their carefully maintained boundaries. Margaret felt herself slipping, her guard lowering inch by inch under the weight of Claire's gaze and the disarming honesty in her words. She had tried to maintain professionalism, to draw a clear line between them, but it was a losing battle. Claire had a way of pulling her into the moment, making her feel seen in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Claire reached for the sugar bowl, her movements unhurried. "Do you take sugar?" she asked, her tone casual but tinged with something else, something that made Margaret's heart race. Margaret shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No thank you." Claire hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You seem like someone who prefers things as they are. No additives, no distractions." She slid the bowl closer to Margaret anyway, her fingers brushing the back of Margaret's hand as she did. The touch was brief, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through Margaret's entire body. Her breath caught, and her hands trembled ever so slightly as she withdrew them from the table. The cafe, the sounds, the people, all of it faded into the background as her mind zeroed in on that single point of connection. It was as if Claire had reached past the walls Margaret had spent years building and touched something raw and unprotected within her. "I have to go," Margaret said abruptly, her voice tight. Claire blinked, clearly surprised by the sudden shift in demeanor. "Did I say something wrong?" Margaret stood, her movements jerky and uncoordinated as she gathered her coat and bag. No, I have work to do. Papers to grade. Claire didn't argue. She leaned back in her chair, watching Margaret with an expression that was equal parts understanding and intrigue. Her lips curved into a slow, enigmatic smile, one that seemed to say she knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret turned and left, her steps hurried and uneven. She didn't look back, but she could feel Claire's gaze following her, the weight of it lingering long after she stepped out into the cool evening air. In the days that followed, Margaret threw herself into her work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. She arrived early to her office, stayed late, and buried herself in essays and lesson plans as if sheer effort could erase the memory of that touch and the emotions it had stirred. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. The sensation of Claire's fingers brushing hers replayed in her mind like a haunting melody, impossible to silence. Her avoidance extended to the classroom. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on her notes during lectures, deliberately avoiding looking at Claire. But Claire's presence was impossible to ignore. She always sat in the front row, her gaze steady and unrelenting as if daring Margaret to acknowledge her. It wasn't just her physical presence. It was the intensity of her attention, the way she seemed to occupy more space than she should. It wasn't long before others began to notice. "You've been distracted lately," Professor Alan Rhodes, a colleague and longtime acquaintance, remarked during a faculty meeting. His tone was light, but there was a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Anything you'd like to share?" Margaret forced a tight smile. "Just busy with the new semester." Alan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I've heard you've taken quite the interest in one of your students. Claire Bellamy, isn't it?" The blood drained from Margaret's face. "That's ridiculous," she said quickly, her voice sharper than intended. "Relax, Margaret," Alan said with a chuckle. "I'm not accusing you of anything. Just be careful. People talk." The warning lingered in Margaret's mind long after the meeting ended. She couldn't afford to be reckless. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked so hard for, was at stake. And yet, even as she resolved to put more distance between herself and Claire, part of her ached at the thought. The confrontation came late one afternoon, after class had ended and the hallways were mostly empty. Margaret was gathering her things when Claire approached her desk, her footsteps light but deliberate. "Professor Hargrove," Claire said, her voice soft but insistent. "Can we talk?" Margaret didn't look up. "I'm busy, Claire." "Please," Claire pressed. "Just for a minute." Margaret sighed, setting down her papers. "This isn't appropriate." "Neither is avoiding me," Claire said, her tone carrying a hint of frustration. "Did I do something to offend you?" Margaret finally met her gaze, and the vulnerability in Claire's expression struck her like a blow. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" Claire stepped closer, her eyes searching Margaret's face. "Because I feel like every time I try to get close to you, you pull away." The words hit too close to home. Margaret's composure cracked, and before she could stop herself she said, "You don't understand what you're asking of me." "Then explain it to me," Claire replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "Because I think you're feeling the same thing I am, and it's not going away just because you want it to." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The air between them grew heavy, charged with an intensity that neither of them could deny. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, Margaret leaned forward. Their lips met in a kiss that was quick, intense, and utterly devastating. It was like a dam breaking, the flood of emotions Margaret had kept bottled up finally spilling over. For a brief, fleeting moment nothing else mattered, not the rules, not the risks, not the world beyond that room. But just as quickly as it began, Margaret pulled away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This can't happen," she said, her voice shaking. Claire's expression was a mix of longing and defiance. "It already did." Margaret turned and fled, leaving Claire standing alone in the empty classroom. But as she walked away, her heart pounding and her mind racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The kiss lingered in Margaret's mind like a forbidden melody, haunting her waking hours and slipping into her dreams. She couldn't escape it no matter how hard she tried. Every detail was seared into her memory. The softness of Claire's lips, the electricity that had surged through her, the brief, reckless abandon of it all. It had been an eruption of everything she had tried to suppress, and now that it was out there was no way to put it back. And so Margaret retreated. She avoided Claire with a determination that bordered on desperation. In class, she addressed the students as a collective, her eyes never settling on Claire for more than a fleeting moment. Outside of class, she left her office door firmly closed, retreating into solitude whenever possible. She threw herself into her work, drowning in essays and lesson plans, hoping the routine would quiet the storm inside her. It didn't. Claire, however, didn't press. For the first few days her presence in class was subdued. The spark of mischief and confidence that had once defined her demeanor was replaced by something quieter, more guarded. But as the week wore on, Claire began to pull back entirely. Her seat in the front row was empty one day, then two, and by the end of the week Margaret couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of dread growing in her chest. Margaret tried to tell herself it was for the best. Perhaps this was the clean break she needed to regain control, to salvage what remained of her carefully constructed life. But the hollow ache that settled in her chest told a different story. Claire's absence wasn't a relief. It was a wound, one that refused to heal. It wasn't until Margaret overheard two students talking in the hallway that she realized just how much she had lost. "Did you hear Claire's thinking of dropping out?" one student whispered. "Seriously? I thought she loved it here." "Yeah, but I guess something happened. She's been spending all her time in the library, avoiding everyone." Margaret's heart sank. Dropping out. The idea sent a wave of panic crashing over her. She had thought she could ignore this, could push Claire away and pretend it didn't matter. But now, faced with the possibility of Claire leaving entirely, Margaret realized how wrong she had been. She couldn't let this end like this. The library was nearly empty when Margaret arrived, the dim light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the rows of bookshelves. She found Claire at a table near the back, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. Her hair was tied back loosely, and there was a tiredness in her posture that Margaret hadn't seen before. "Claire," Margaret said softly, her voice trembling. Claire looked up, her eyes widening briefly in surprise before narrowing in guarded skepticism. "Professor Hargrove," she said, her tone formal and distant. "What are you doing here?" Margaret hesitated, the words she had rehearsed on the way over slipping through her fingers. I heard you're thinking of leaving." Claire leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "What does it matter to you?" "It matters," Margaret said, her voice breaking slightly. "It matters more than I can explain." Claire's expression hardened. "Really? Because it didn't seem to matter when you were avoiding me all week. Or when you pretended nothing happened between us." Margaret flinched, the truth of Claire's words cutting deep. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to handle what I was feeling." "And what are you feeling, Margaret?" Claire asked, her tone sharper now, the use of her first name striking like a thunderclap. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're too afraid to feel anything." Margaret's chest tightened. "You don't understand. I have responsibilities, a career, a reputation. If anyone found out—" "Stop," Claire interrupted, standing abruptly. Her eyes were blazing now, the emotion in them threatening to spill over. "You're so focused on what other people think, on what you might lose, that you're forgetting what you could have. Don't you see that?" Margaret shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I don't have the freedom you do, Claire. I can't just throw everything away for something that might not last." Claire's laugh was bitter, her voice shaking with frustration. "Freedom? You think I don't have anything to lose? I've spent my whole life fighting to be seen, to be taken seriously, to not be dismissed because of how I look or who I am. But you know what? I'd rather risk everything than live like you, trapped in a cage you built yourself." The words hit like a blow, and Margaret felt herself crumbling under the weight of them. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she couldn't deny the truth in Claire's accusation. She was trapped, bound by fear and convention, and it was suffocating her. "I care about you," Margaret said finally, her voice breaking. "More than I should. But I don't know how to make this work." Claire's eyes softened, but there was still an edge of sadness in her expression. "You don't have to figure it out right now. But I can't keep waiting for you to decide if I'm worth the risk." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, that could bridge the chasm between them. But the words wouldn't come. Claire reached for her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. "I need to go," she said quietly. "Take care of yourself, Margaret." And then she was gone, leaving Margaret alone in the silent library. The emptiness she felt in that moment was more profound than anything she had ever experienced. For the first time she realized that her fear hadn't just kept her safe, it had kept her alone. As she stood there, surrounded by the echoes of Claire's words, Margaret knew she had a choice to make. Fear or love? Safety or freedom? It wasn't an easy choice, but it was one she couldn't avoid any longer. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield as Margaret drove through the dark, empty streets. Charleston, usually so vibrant with its historic charm, was now cloaked in shadows, the storm muting its usual hum. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, her breath fogging the car's interior as the heat struggled to keep the chill at bay. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn back, to retreat into the safety of the familiar. But she couldn't. The weeks of silence had been unbearable. She had thrown herself into her work, buried her emotions beneath mountains of papers and books, yet the ache remained. Claire's absence was a void Margaret couldn't fill, no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise. Every corner of her life seemed to whisper Claire's name, from the empty front row seat in her classroom to the faint scent of coffee that lingered whenever she passed the cafe. It was maddening, and it forced Margaret to confront the truth she had spent a lifetime avoiding. She wanted Claire. Not just her presence, not just her voice or her laugh, but her. Margaret wanted the fire and passion that Claire brought into her carefully controlled world. She wanted the chaos, the unpredictability, the raw, unfiltered connection. And for the first time Margaret realized she was willing to risk everything to have it. Her car came to a stop outside Claire's apartment building, a modest structure tucked away on a quiet street. The rain cascaded down the windows in sheets, and Margaret hesitated, gripping the book in her lap like a lifeline. The well-worn copy of 100 Poems of Rumi felt heavier than it should, its pages marked with notes and folded corners, each one a reminder of the bridge Claire had tried to build between them. Margaret took a deep, shaky breath and stepped out of the car. The rain soaked her instantly, chilling her to the bone as she hurried to the entrance. Her heart pounded in her chest as she climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. By the time she reached Claire's door, she was drenched, her hair plastered to her face and her coat dripping onto the worn carpet. But she didn't care. None of it mattered now. She knocked. The sound was timid at first, barely audible over the storm outside. Margaret hesitated, her pulse racing before knocking again, firmer this time. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain and her own ragged breathing. Then she heard footsteps on the other side of the door, slow and hesitant. The door opened. Claire stood there, her expression one of surprise and guarded curiosity. She was dressed in an oversized sweater and leggings, her hair loose and slightly messy as if she'd been curled up reading or writing. Her gaze swept over Margaret, taking in her rain-soaked appearance, the book clutched tightly in her hands, the raw vulnerability in her eyes. Margaret. Claire's voice was soft, almost disbelieving. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She held out the book, her hands trembling. Sometimes, she said, her voice cracking, the poems say what the words can't. Claire's eyes widened, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Margaret's as she took the book. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down Margaret's spine. I was wrong, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. I was so afraid of losing everything that I forgot what it felt like to want something. To want someone. And I want you, Claire. I don't know what comes next or how to make it work, but I can't keep running from this. From us. The silence that followed was agonizing. Margaret's heart felt like it might burst as she waited, her breath hitching with every second Claire didn't respond. But then slowly Claire's expression softened. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and the smallest smile tugged at the corners of her lips. You're soaking wet, Claire said, her voice tinged with humor and something warmer, deeper. Margaret let out a breathless laugh, relief washing over her like the rain still falling outside. I couldn't wait for the storm to pass. Claire stepped aside, opening the door fully. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, the warmth of the apartment enveloping her. The door clicked shut behind them and suddenly the world outside didn't matter anymore. Claire turned to face Margaret, her gaze searching as if trying to memorize every detail of this moment. You really mean it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not going to run again? Margaret shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'm done running." And then Claire closed the distance between them, her hands cupping Margaret's face as she kissed her. This time there was no hesitation, no fear holding them back. The kiss was deep, tender, and full of everything they hadn't been able to say. Margaret's arms wrapped around Claire's waist, pulling her closer, and for the first time, the ache inside her began to fade. The world around them seemed to disappear. The storm outside, the risks, the rules. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the way Claire felt in her arms, the way their hearts seemed to beat in sync, the way their souls seemed to recognize each other in that moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and flushed, Claire rested her forehead against Margaret's. "This won't be easy," she said, her voice tinged with both hope and caution. "There are going to be challenges." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "But I'm ready to face them. As long as I have you, I'll fight for this. For us." Claire smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "Then let's do this." And as they stood there wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. For the first time she wasn't bound by fear or expectations. For the first time she was alive. And as Claire pulled her into another kiss, Margaret knew she had finally found something worth risking everything for.